Hello, just doing a quick video here, well, I hope fairly quick, just showing freehand technique. Get a lot of questions about this, and it's something that I'm always working on and studying other people's methods, how they apply solutions to the problem of holding a tool steady as you move it across an abrasive. That's basically, the bottom line, and really at the high end. For regular sharpening, if you're within a couple degrees, you'll probably do fine. But it makes it much easier to diagnose things like, warped blades and issues with the steel, or burr detection, removal, all that stuff. If you have a little more control than just a few degrees, if you can get it down to 1 or a half, and all of that comes down to identifying slop movement in the tool as it's going. A big part of that is just observing it often, but over the years I have come up with a bunch of little tricks, guidelines I use, some of which are not written in stone. I change it up all the time a little bit, but some of the basic stuff is the same no matter what I'm working on. So I'm just going to jam through a couple of them. Most of them apply to regular knives, and they will apply to woodworking tools, hatchets, things like that. But basically I use something that's very similar to a Japanese stroke. I do not normally work off of a bath with the stone dead out in front of me. I like to work it at a little bit of an angle. In fact, I move it all over the place because I frequently do not lap my stones completely flat. Usually I just let them get a little bit dirty if it's a waterstone. And then the next time I take it out, I'll give it a quick rub down, and I'll see the high spots. The spots that are still dirty are the lower spots, and I just work on the high spots. If it's a real important job, I'll lap the thing flat, but most of the time it's not necessary. Anyway, very similar to a Japanese pass. I usually tuck that thing right in against the palm, and I get it pretty tight with these 3 fingers, and that provides a center point for me to hold. Now I can feel the handle twisting. If it twists, if my control starts to get sloppy. I got the thumb here, and that's good control, and it's detecting stuff for me too. So if there's any movement, I can feel it. And then the more points of contact you have, the more sensitive your awareness will be. I'm also using the feel of the knife on the stone but a lot of it is this finger here is providing contact pressure right where I'm grinding, and I've also over the years learned to not keep my fingers straight. I bend them just a little bit, and I don't do that all the time. I'll get sloppy, and in some tools it's just not terribly convenient, but most of the time I find if I keep my fingers bent, then that force comes straight down into the knife. If my fingers are straight, then I'm counteracting more of that force with this hand. I don't want to have to fight myself. Everything should complement itself. So to the extent that if there's nothing there, this is going to push the blade flat, I want the least amount of effort needed to counteract that. And if my fingers are straight, then I have to use a lot more force. I mean, obviously it depends on how hard I'm pressing, but all things being relative, I keep my fingers bent, and that's part of it. When I get up right to the coil, I can do this with a pass like that if I need to get right in tight to it. Otherwise, I will keep it at about a 45-degree angle. And once I've gotten right down in there, then I'll just go back to it. I work all over the stone. Usually I'll go from one end to the other, and then spin it end for end. And if I'm going in this direction, I'll work off of this corner. This way I'm working the whole stone. I'm going to knock that thing down. Now when I flip it, and here's the other thing too, when I'm going in this direction, I usually only use the index finger and the middle finger. And that determines my pitch across the stone to some extent. I normally shoot for about a 45-degree grind path. I find that does 2 things. One, it cuts very nicely on a pull. It gives me a little more finesse on a push, and that motion across the stone gives me the most support. Whereas if I'm dead perpendicular to my pass, I'm going to be fighting the maximum amount of wobble. If I am dead parallel to my pass, you can get very good accuracy that way, but again, there's not a ton of support, so if it starts to drift off, there's not a lot of feel to it. The other thing that I have learned to do is, and none of this stuff is really my own, although a lot of it I had to come back and learn on my own after being exposed to it. Say, oh hey, maybe these people really do know what they're talking about. I tend to emphasize the push. The pull is really just to help grind, to help keep the thing nice and flat on the stone. The push is what's doing most of the work. Even when I get down to burr removal, let's say there was a burr on there I want to get rid of, I'm going to go light, 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 and before I flip sides, I'm going to give it a push, because whatever burr is still there, I want it to flip, if I haven't gotten it all. As long as I'm reducing it, and I can feel it, I'm not going to bother. Once I can't feel it anymore, boom, back pass. Now these two fingers here, for this side of the blade, when I flip it, I'm going to use these two fingers. And the other thing I'm going to do is I usually pull the stone a little bit, or I'll just leave it a little more at an angle to start. I find that trying to get fingers that don't line up well right with the edge in on the action without getting too, it just increases the amount of push that I then have to counteract. And the other trick I have learned when I'm working with the edge away from me, and I will use sort of a hybrid Japanese pass where I hold the thing straight down through, pretty much the mirror image of this side, and I get pretty good control that way. Or I will also use something that's a little more traditional, where instead of having the blade, the handle through the center of my palm, I'll tuck it off to the side. It's still the same principle though. These fingers grab it tight. They provide a pivot point that I can feel. Thumb on the spine, finger on the heel. And these are balancing forces as much as detecting. So these provide my angle control. And now I'm using these two fingers, and that helps me keep my angle nice and set. Anytime I can, I like to get a little bit of a sweep. I find that helps promote good angle control as well. And the other thing that I have noticed, and I'm going this way for the same reason that I bend my fingers when I'm working on this side, to keep the contact force straight down as close as possible without burning the tips of my fingers off on the stone. I will get my palm lower than my fingertips, and that provides like a sort of a hanging, sort of dead weight to these fingers, rather than have my palm, the higher up my palm gets, the higher up the bevel, the pressure is going to go. So the lower my palm is, the more relaxed everything becomes. And then just elevate the handle as I go. But that's kind of a different thing. For mechanical technique, the other thing that I'm trying to do is not be perfectly linear as I go. I want a little bit of a sweep. All these things tend to promote more accuracy. On this side, it's the same thing. As opposed to this, which is more of a straight linear, if you can put a little bit of an arc in there, you might see an improvement. That's how I do it. And it's the same thing, not quite, but the same thing when I'm doing woodworking tools. Now I like to have the stone a little more toward me because it's the nature of the beast. But either way, I'm going to bend my fingertips as I work on it. One of the things that I always do, I always want to work from the shoulder out. So as I work, I can get the minimum amount of feedback when I'm on a dull bevel, flat to it. There's no cutting edge catching the stone, and the shoulder's not catching the stone. So what I do is lower it as I go. Every now and then, every couple passes, just boop, give it a little bump on the shoulder, and I do this with regular cutlery as well. And that gives me a tactile, audible indication of where I am, and I can see, the mud's building up on the shoulder. It's not quite to the cutting edge, and that's what I want to see. I always want to work from the shoulder out, and that way I'm never reaching, extending myself, elevating the tool to hit the cutting edge, or I'm also not floating somewhere in my error zone, because no matter what I do, there's always going to be a little bit of a curve. But if I constantly recalibrate to the shoulder, I find it gets much more flat. And this is the same thing with a chisel. You know, I don't. Anytime I'm forced to go linear, I find that I have way more play than if I can adopt some sort of an arc to it. And while I might not have any arc at the wrist, you know, it's all happening at the elbow. And the only rule that I really don't want to violate if I'm doing this, depending on the type of tool, I don't want my scratch pattern to go dead across the tool. I always want it to be at some sort of an angle, and that promotes a little more strength. As you get down into like the polishing grade stones, it becomes less and less important. But at the mid-grade, medium grade, coarse grade, really it should be at some sort of an angle. That's my philosophy. And because I don't use a bridge, I can move this all over the place. If I'm working on a woodworking tool, I might be over here. If the last time I lapped the stone, I saw that it cleaned up on, you know, 2 outside corners or something, guess what? That's where I'm working first. I might not get it perfectly flat, but as long as I keep moving all over the stone, it doesn't matter. And this is the same for any stone that wears down. You know, a crystalline stone, pretty much any of your silicon carbide stones. And I also find that even if the stone does not wear, and I don't have an issue with it lapping, becoming out of true, it's a good idea to move all over the stone anyway. So that's pretty much in a nutshell. So the basics are really just keeping the fingers bent, keeping my palm lower than the tool, and trying to get that pressure from this offhand fingertip to not fight anything as much as possible and not burn my fingertips up too bad on the stone. You do that a couple times and you won't want it to keep happening, especially if you do it on something like a medium or a fairly coarse diamond stone. That smarts and takes a little while to heal up. So that's pretty much it. And one of the things I like to do is, as I finish, because I'm referencing to these 2 fingertips on my stroke, my finishing, deburring pass, the scratch marks, all that stuff tend to continue to line up. They're symmetrical side to side. That's not really important to cutting, but it is a big help for me in terms of eliminating burrs and detecting them visually. If the scratch pattern starts to shift a lot, it becomes difficult to see potential defects, position changes in angle. If my scratch patterns all lay in the same angle and I change degrees, well, when I look at it, I'm going to see that immediately. If my scratch pattern's all over the place and I change angle, I can't really see that. So again, this is not really stuff that's needed to understand for most sharpening, hand sharpening. You really don't. If you're within a couple of degrees, you can do whatever you want, and if by all means, if moving back and forth, whatever works. But I came to the conclusion quite some time ago that I'm not terribly gifted in holding angles, and if I want to really nail it, then I need to start to remove options for myself to get into trouble, and this is one of the ways that I do that. Alright, well that's it. Thanks for watching.